Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. My guests come from all walks of life and are people who get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not-so-distant past. The jumping-off point is where they become curious, then enter the rabbit hole into discovery, some through scholarly research, others through pop culture, documentaries, and other podcasts. We look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Be sure to like and subscribe. It really does help to spread the word. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to leave us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. You can also find us at armchairhistorians.com. Armchair Historians is an independent podcast. If you'd like to support the show, become a patron through Patreon or buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow armchair historians. Welcome to part 2 of my interview with Marcus Rediker and David Lester, authors of the graphic novel Under the Banner of King Death, Pirates of the Atlantic. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend you go back and listen to part 1 in order to get the full benefit of this amazing history. In part 2, we talk about what goes into turning a scholarly work into a graphic novel. Who were these men and women who turned to a life of piracy, and why this history matters?
Yeah, in 2004, I published this book, Villains of All Nations, Atlantic Pirates in the Golden Age, and it is a history of pirates from below during the 17 teens and 1720s. That's the tail end of the golden age of piracy. And in that, I talk about the extraordinary social experiment that pirates undertook. These are basically just poor, ordinary, super exploited common sailors who decide that they're going to live as well as they can for as long as they can, and they become pirates. And they organize their ships in very democratic and egalitarian ways. And this is a stunning contrast to the way that merchant ships were organized and naval ships were organized. And I think this is actually one of the reasons why the lords of trade, we might call them, the ruling classes of that era, were so keen to exterminate pirates. It was not just that they attacked the shipping of the world, and they did that, and they captured thousands of ships, and they caused a crisis in trade, in international trade. But they also were providing this subversive example of how you could run a ship in a freer, more democratic, and less violent way. Your listeners would need to know that in this time period, the ship captain, whether in the merchant service or the Navy, was an extremely violent figure who could beat or whip the sailors at will, and they did it routinely. And this, of course, is one of the things that drove people into piracy. And this is what David and I have emphasized in not just telling a pirate story, but putting into that story the social process by which people made the decision to risk their lives as pirates. So we're trying to give a broader, deeper, more social view of what happened and why. And we're also trying to undercut the mythology around pirates, which basically just sees them as greedy thugs. They could be violent. They were violent. Piracy was based on the threat of violence, but so too was the world that they came from. It was an extremely violent age. So anyway, we're trying to show that when you ask a different question, and the question being, what did pirates think they were doing? And why did they do it? You come up with a very different portrait of these people who loom so large in our popular culture. Now, how we came to the specific story of Under the Banner of King Death is a little odd and maybe of interest in that I worked for a time with an LA film producer to make a film based on Villains of All Nations. And Lionsgate actually took an option on that book for several years. We went through the production process. The film never got made, but in basically adapting that book, Villains of All Nations, for the screen, I wrote a storyline, basically taking a whole generation of pirates and developing therefrom three main characters and a set of experiences that people went through. And that film treatment actually became the storyline that David and I used in writing this book.
You've written a scholarly book. We kind of know the storyboard, that idea was written for a potential screenplay. And then, David, did you write the graphic novel yourself based on everything that you were given? And then, of course, the amazing artwork. Were you responsible for all that, or did you guys co-write I don't even know how to say it because I've never read a graphic novel, but it's like a cartoon book.
Yeah, we call it the script. And so that's the first stage in making a graphic novel, is to write the script. And so I took Marcus's detailed outline of the story and I broke it down into scenes the way you would in a film screenplay, with directions, basically stage directions on each scene, and dialogue broken down as to who said what. And so once I did that, I then gave the draft to Marcus and Paul to get their feedback and changes. And so we went back and forth like that over a few months, making many versions of the script. And one of the methods that I have used is to actually act out the script myself. And I enlisted my partner, Wendy, to do that. So she took on several characters, I took on several. And it makes a huge difference to say the words out loud in terms of how is it flowing, and is it coherent as it goes from scene to scene. So that was part of the process. But once the script was approved by everyone, then the drawing began. And the drawing process is to first take a pencil and draw everything in pencil. And then the next stage is to ink it all with a pen and then erase those pencil lines, and then to paint on it, in my case, with watercolor paint. And so at that point, you then scan the drawings and design the pages and then put the word balloons in and the dialogue, and then you have a book. And unlike many people who do graphic novels, they do them on the computers, but I actually draw everything by hand except for the word balloons and the text in the word balloons. So that in essence is the process of how we have been making these two books we've done together, and as we will continue with the third book we're working on. I relied on Marcus's book, Villains of All Nations, to write the script, but I also had to do a certain amount of research myself in terms of when you're drawing something, you have to know what kind of clothes did people wear, what kind of hats, what kind of shoes, and also you have to know from the working class to the ruling class. And what kind of food did they eat? What kind of pipes did they smoke? How did they dance? How did they sing? And finally, how did they talk? And so that was a point of much discussion among the three of us in terms of, do we really present how they talk in the early 18th century, or do we do a hybrid of that? And that's eventually what we decided, to give a flavor of the speech, because I think modern audiences, modern readers would perhaps have trouble with some of it if we were completely accurate in terms of how people did speak. Those are all the things you consider when you're doing a historical graphic novel like this that goes back 300 years.
So, two things. When I first started writing my work of historical fiction, which was a master's thesis for my graduate writing program, I started out with trying to do all this kind of archaic sounding Old English. And that was the first thing. They're like, no, you need to change this and you need to make it accessible. And I was wondering about that. And you just explained how you went about that, because I felt like it had a mixture of a flavor of what it was like, and then it's also accessible to your audience. And then the other thing is, when I was reading the novel, because the reason I'm going to England, to London specifically in May and June, is that I am going to go mudlarking. Which, do you guys know what mudlarking is?
I sure do.
And I was there last year, and it was the first time I went. I did mudlarking, but I saw the pipes. and the pipes stuck out to me. I have a whole display of clay pipes in my house. So I was like, oh, that is so authentic that they're smoking these long clay pipes. I got really excited about that. Marcus, did you have anything else to say about that?
Since you mentioned clay pipes, Anne Marie, here's a white pipe.
Nice, a pipe stem. I know what it is.
A pipe stem. Okay, but you know where I found it? Mm-mm. I found it in Sierra Leone at the shoreline of a big slave trading fortress.
Is it the one that's in the book?
Yes. So this is kind of chilling. When you find these things.
I totally have chills when you said that. I still have them.
I also found some beads, Venetian glass beads that were used in trading. And these are just things that washed up on the shore hundreds of years later. So that kind of history is still there and still alive. Mm-hmm. I would add one thing to what David said about language, because this was a really interesting problem for us, because we're very committed to evoking the social reality of the ship. And we decided that what we wanted to do was to give just enough flavor to the colorful nature of sailors' speech that people could imagine that's what they sounded like. That's the kind of language they used. But of course, we couldn't always assume that people would know the meaning of some of these terms. So we decided to use a glossary. And that actually does help. To kiss the gunner's daughter, people wouldn't know that meant that you were strapped by your captain to one of the ship's cannon and flogged.
Okay, to find out more about Pirate Speak, I highly recommend you go back and listen to our last mini episode in which David and Marcus take the Let's Get Quizzical challenge. Now that makes sense why the index was in there. It just all came together for me when you said that. So yeah, you use some of the language that would have been used, but you do it really well. I mean, I think for a graphic novel. Who is your audience for this graphic novel?
Well, I'll answer that first. We have to go back to the importance of the use of graphic novels in telling history. And I know that from talking to teachers who teach history, that they have said that students are increasingly unable to read longer texts like books, like a full prose book. And they're finding that graphic novels are essential in the process of teaching history, because the students actually are very engaged, because they're very sophisticated about the use of images and text together. And so they really respond to this genre, this new form. And even though comics have been around for over 100 years, it somehow has become incredibly relevant and contemporary style. And it's one of the genres that is rising in terms of when they do a list of the best-selling books. Graphic novels keep rising in terms of how many people are discovering them. And so this is why I feel like it's such an important area that we're working in. I'm so happy to be a part of this, because I feel like if the works are being used in schools or in universities, these people who are reading them are the future union leaders, the future voters, the future social activists. And if they're very engaged with this is really an important part of activist art. And so I feel like there's a great amount of benefit to doing the books in this way. To me, it's a very exciting area to be a part of.
My goal, Anne Marie, in all this, and I think David and I share this, is that we want to bring this really quite inspiring history from below to people in as many ways as we can. You know, there are people who will read a graphic novel who won't read a scholarly history. There may be people who will watch a documentary film who wouldn't read a graphic novel. So the point is, we want to get a certain set of ideas across to readers, especially to young readers, and in a way that is consistent with their visual ways of learning, as David has said. So we definitely did have younger readers in mind. And I'll tell you, this is one of the reasons why graphic novels are now of interest to so many different publishers. because it's not only that they are kind of a rising genre, it's that they promise the diversification of the readership. And they can then hook young people on reading and lead to, other sorts of interests.
Wow. That's the spirit of my podcast, Armchair Historians, right there. I feel like I want history to be accessible to anyone, in the conversation and dialogue between any people about history is the touchstone to so many important conversations and realizations. And I love that.
Also, comics are, I think, less intimidating than approaching a very scholarly prose book. And because I know some readers might be intimidated by a book like that, and this kind of gets over that, just as your podcast does. It's accessible. And also in the case of wordless graphic novels, there are no barriers to readers. Readers can engage with that.
Oh, I've never heard of a wordless graphic novel.
They do exist, yes.
Wow.
But that means you could be anywhere in the world and engage with a wordless graphic novel. So that's another sort of factor of the potential of graphic novels.
So why this history?
Pirates are cultural icons in this country and around the world. I first published an article about pirates in 1981. The response to that has been kind of overwhelming. In fact, it was so overwhelming that I vowed when I published this book, Villains of All Nations, that I was going to be done with pirates. That was my swan song. I'm done. I'm out. And look here. 19 years later, David and I have published a new book on pirates, which only goes to show that once you get involved studying and writing about pirates, you can never escape them because there's just so much interest out there. Well, it turns out that the actual lived history of pirates, the social history, the history from below, is much more fascinating than the Hollywood myth. What these people did on the high seas, carrying out this social experiment, enacting democratic rights at a time when poor people had no democratic rights anywhere in the world. And we got to remember that. So basically, I think David and I both felt that this was a very powerful example of resistance to the most powerful people on earth at that time, the big architects of empire and of global capitalism. And poor people fought back, and even though they didn't win in the long term, they did set a powerful example, a very subversive example of how poor people could live freely for a little while. So I think that is actually valuable for people to hear about now.
I keep thinking about Hollywood and how pirates have been depicted in popular culture, which I always like to touch on popular culture. But the pirates that I've seen are either cast in the light of villain or hero.
There's a romantic view of pirates that, maybe a Errol Flynn type, a wronged aristocrat who goes to sea as a pirate to recover his honor, or someone who goes to sea because he's in love with the governor's daughter. These sorts of things are very common, but that kind of stuff didn't really happen. Most pirates were just ordinary common sailors, beaten around the deck and just got tired of it and decided that they were going to fight back. But yeah, the pirate is truly a mythic figure. But embedded in that mythos is an understanding, I think a lot of people share this understanding, that pirates were rebels. They did fight back. And this is one of the things that makes them so attractive to so many people. And so we're trying to give much greater depth to that dim perception. People sort of sense that that's true, but we want to show exactly how that was true by giving you a historically accurate view of pirates and what they were all about.
David?
And I think our book really is a depiction of rebellion in action. And I hope that it's an inspiration to modern day activists who are fighting exploitation, because it has been around for centuries. And I think there's a lot to gain from our book in that way. The resistance to tyranny isn't new. It is part of a long, noble tradition, and pirates are part of that tradition. When you asked why pirates, certainly I was really deeply moved by Marcus's book, Villains of All Nations. And I highly recommend people read that book, because Marcus has a great way of starting a book. It's very exciting. His depiction of history is incredible to read, very dynamic. And so I have a copy of his book, and for when I was working on the script, it's full of things that I've underlined, and in great detail I referred back to his book over and over again to try to encompass as much of it as I could into the story that we tell it under the banner of King Death. And I couldn't fit everything in. Of course, there's limitations to the graphic novel form. In many ways, graphic novels are somewhat of an introduction to a moment in history. And that is in many ways their value too, because once you read a graphic novel, you can then go to the original source, you can do further research, and I think that's a great engagement with a book. The engagement for the reader doesn't end with reading the book. It actually hopefully carries on in their own life, and it's a profound moment between reader and book.
Could I just add something?
Yeah.
It's one thing, though, let me just mention this, David, and ask you to comment on it. It's one thing to read a good history book. It's a completely different thing to translate a history book into powerful imagery, which is what you've done. I mean, essentially, you created an almost filmic version of that story. So how do you go from the book to the image?
I really think of the book that we've created, how it links to all the work I've done. And generally, I've told very gritty social justice stories. And this is no different. And I want the book to be visually challenging in the way that I want you to feel like you're going back in time to the 18th century. And I like to say it's drawn in glorious black and white with a touch of film noir going to the 18th century. And so I use a lot of brush strokes, a lot of splatters of paint on the pages, because I want the reader to feel they're holding something that is a document of history, a document of time, and to feel engaged visually in that way that matches the gritty nature of the content, so that the drawings are linked and make a connection. Because a lot of graphic novels they're beautifully done, but they look like they're beautifully done. They're colorful and great artists have done them, but I'm not sure that they really link to the content. And I feel there's a separation, whereas I feel with what I'm doing with Marcus is I'm trying to match the history that he has researched and presented in his book, and try to make it into a graphic novel that is as visceral as his text and the visceral nature you can get from a deep dive into prose. Anyway, that's the approach that I'm taking with the book. So it has a lot of looseness to it, and a lot of grays and blacks, and a lot of sense of movement to it as well. I did not want the page designs to be static, and I wanted the reader to be really engaged in a deep sort of making a deep connection to the book.
Right. I'm looking at the book as you're talking. It's beautiful. Every picture is a work of art. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the story. Now, I know that one of the characters is somebody that's plucked out of history books, is an actual person, but I don't really know too much about how much of it is based in fact, or not factual at all. Maybe you could talk a little bit about all that.
Okay, here's one way to think about it. Everything that is in our graphic novel did not happen. Okay? It's a graphic novel. But everything that is in our graphic novel could have happened, because we understand the historical context and the way these people thought and acted. So it's, even if it's not literally true, for example, there wasn't a pirate named John Gwynn. although there were lots of black pirates. There wasn't a sailor named Rediker, Dutch sailor, but there were lots of Dutch pirates. There was someone named Mary Read. And so but almost everything in the book has a very clear historical antecedent. The book begins with a hanging. This actually did happen. It was a man named William Fly in Boston in 1726. Who said the very things that we quote him as saying. A lot of the text bubbles are actually repeating verbatim things that appear in the historical sources. So this, the reason why we couldn't call it simply a history is because we don't know what a black sailor and a white sailor said to each other when they found themselves trapped in the lower deck of a slave ship. We can't know that. We can't know that level of historical detail. We can know what kinds of people they were. We can know what kinds of experiences they had. And we can reason therefrom as to what they would have said and what they would have done. And that's what we did in the book. But it does require disciplined imagination working in tandem with a great depth of historical sources. I'd say that's the way we work.
David?
That was a great answer. I don't,
Okay.
I can't top that.
Good answer, Marcus. Good answer.
Thank you.
We both approve. So in this graphic novel, like I said earlier, the heroes are the pirates. The villains are the man. What do you say to people who believe that pirates were nothing more than violent criminals?
Well, look, the vast majority of writing about pirates has been that they were violent criminals. Right? That perspective is not lacking. Mm-hmm. We've seen that, and people have said that over and over and over again. And it's kind of boring. And you know what? It's not even true. That if you study the sources deeply, you will see that these pirates were complicated human beings just like the rest of us, who had a variety of motives. They had experiences that shaped the decisions that they took. My problem with that sort of critic is to say, hey, go read some of the sources. We didn't make this stuff up. This is all documented. This is in the, go through the footnotes of Villains of All Nations. You'll find proof for every claim that we make. So basically, I think that's what we do. Now, pirates were violent. No question about it. We show our protagonists throwing a brutal ship captain over the side of the ship. That happened. This guy's name was Skinner. He was a slave trade captain, one of the most violent that you could imagine. Not saying that pirates weren't violent, but we are saying that there's a lot more to the story than that. And the other part of the story is probably the most important.
As well, I might add that it is the nature of history that it's complex, and there are many people I admire or groups that I admire, and they are not necessarily completely without criticism or that kind of complexity. And so when we present history, we have to be careful about that, but we have to acknowledge that history is pretty broad in terms of when we talk about any grouping. And I mentioned the industrial workers of the world earlier. Well, were they perfect? Were they without criticism? Absolutely not. So, but is their story important? Is their history important? Absolutely. So that's the way I kind of relate to this. And I think it's important that we tell this story because pirates, because it isn't like there's a ton of work out there covering this area. So I feel like we're breaking new ground by boldly taking this story on and trying to present it in the form of popular culture called a graphic novel.
I would have never thought of the pirate story as a workers' rights story until you guys framed it for me. If my listener could remember one thing about this history, what would you like them to remember? David, go first.
Well, as I said before, I think it's a tale of rebellion and progressive rebellion, I would add. And I think it shows the long history of the fight against tyranny. And I think if readers take one thing away from it is the heroic nature of these pirates. Remember, they were at the bottom rungs of society, and they rose up and they created a democracy on board their ships, if only for a short time. But if they could do it where they had virtually nothing going for them, it should be an inspiration to workers today and anyone fighting for their rights. And so ultimately, yes, I hope people take an inspiration from this book. It's not about the specifics of the history, but it's about the overview of what these pirates were doing. If we can inspire people to the nature of workers' rights or to human rights in general, then I feel like this has been a total success.
Yeah, I would only add that in addition to the social and political meaning of this story and its relevance to the present, I think David and I have tried to show that these pirates were kind of wild and sometimes obscene and funny. In other words, they were kind of a rich collection of humanity. And to be able to see the humanity of people in a struggle like this, I think is a very important thing. And if people could take that away, I think that would be valuable.
I can't think of his name, the captain who he's in the beginning of it, and it's in Sierra Leone, and they attack the compound there.
Right.
Maybe could you just talk a little bit more about that? And that was something that really happened?
Mm-hmm. There was a pirate named Howell Davis who was a very interesting figure. He didn't live very long, but he was known for all kinds of progressive practices. And he did wage a pretty dramatic attack on one of the slave trading fortresses in West Africa. So this, like so many other things in the graphic novel, has got a kind of a factual foundation. Now, we had to embellish it because we don't know what people thought as they were scaling the walls. We don't know what they said to each other. But again, it's a powerful story, and I think it's one that it's worth recovering.
So the pirates, they were pirates, right? They broke into the place and then they freed the slaves. Is that what happened?
Well, we don't know exactly what happened, but we do know that once the soldiers had abdicated, the people who were enslaved there were free to go. And so consequently, the pirates did take a whole lot of gold and silver. Mm-hmm. They did loot the place, as of course that's what they wanted to do. But yeah, people gained their freedom.
Where did they go?
We don't know.
Okay.
We don't know. They might have been re-enslaved for all we know, because some of them were probably, far from home.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, and that was always a danger. I wrote about this in the Slave Ship. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it is true that the story of pirates is a freedom story. Mm-hmm. And we've tried to emphasize that in this book. Well,
David and Marcus, I have enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for joining us today.
It's been a real pleasure. You asked great questions, and it's been good spending this time with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Anne-Marie. It was wonderful to talk to you.
There you have it. David Lester and Marcus Rediker, Under the Banner of King Death. To find out more about the book, David and Marcus, be sure to check out our episode notes. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.